So last time we came together, we studied the book of Matthew for the Bible class, and we will continue there in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. Just to kind of recap about some of the things that we talked about previously, we went over Christ, how he shared a lot of parallels with Moses. In the context here, he is on the mount preaching to his disciples, and he has a lot to say. He is expounding on the law in which they had taken. A lot of the Pharisees and scribes at the time, the leaders, the spiritual leaders, they had perverted it. And Christ was here to set the foundation and to fix some of those things. So if you will, turn to your Bibles to Matthew 5. And I'll just ask a couple of times if those will read some of a verse or two. Just anyone can read it, just so everyone can hear it. And if you have any comments or questions, just raise your hand, or if I'm not seeing you, you can just blurt out, interrupt me. That's fine as well. But we will see in Matthew chapter 5, we first went over the Beatitudes. We went over some of those aspects, who Jesus is addressing, what he is addressing them about. And then we also, I think the last class, we went through verse 13 down to about verse 20. So we talked about the Christian and his influence. A Christian being light. A Christian being salt of the earth. How a Christian is to be. How we're to spread the gospel, be a beacon of hope. And not only that, we looked at verses 17 and 18. I forgot who it was, made a great illustration with a bookshelf. How Christ was building on the things, and once it's complete, there was a new use. I forgot who made that illustration, but it was a really good one last time we came together and talked. I think it was you, brother. Yes, sir.
I don't remember what year it was.
Oh, well, I think so. I think he did, but it was a good illustration. Christ is building on these things, and he's saying that he's not there to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. And now Christ is really setting the groundwork, the foundations for the church to come. Remember, they're still underneath the old law. And Christ is about to really, what we're about to go through in verse 20 or 21 and following, he's going to take some of the problems that the Pharisees had done with this law, and they kind of had some loopholes. And we can see that application today. When we see the writings in the New Testament, we oftentimes try to find loopholes, and Christ is going to be there to address these loopholes and to set the standard and make it clear for those in the audience, and we're going to see that some of them aren't too happy with Christ and what he has to say. So if you would, look with me at verse 21. In verse 21, we're going to see Christ talking about anger and really address anger and murder. So if someone would read verses 21 and 22 for me.
You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder. Whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says you fool shall be guilty enough to go to the fiery hell.
That's right. So he says here, he just addresses that the commandment of God was the simple, thou shalt not kill. And whoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. That you can find this obviously in the book of Leviticus, in Deuteronomy. Moses with the Ten Commandments is a pretty common commandment that we understand and know. And it's to further define that thou shalt not kill, it's really thou shalt not murder. So it's not that they could not kill, defense and wartime, but it's thou shalt not murder. To take the life of someone that is innocent, so to speak. So he sets this standard in verse 21. And he addresses it that thou shalt not kill, whoever shall kill shall be in danger of judgment. But he goes a step further. So these men, these Pharisees and scribes and others who would look at this law would go, okay, so we can't kill, but I'm going to treat my brother with hatred, indignation, anger. And Christ is addressing this, and he's saying, okay, let's take this law a step further. Let's see it in application. You are angry with your brother, and that when you're angry, that's what leads to sin. So Christ here is trying to nip this problem in the bud. He says, don't even have anger against your brother. And it's not just a normal anger. And we're going to look at this here. He's restating here something that they should have known, but it's not a general anger. And I want to set that preface right now, because we see God in His anger. Yes, sir?
Mine says, it's New King James, it says, whoever's angry with his brother without a cause.
Without a cause. Yes, and I know that's without a cause is in some of the older manuscripts and not in some of the others. But we have to be careful there, because without a cause means we can't be, it almost puts a stipulation on no anger at all. So I think if we look at the context here, take a look at Ephesians 4:31 with me. Ephesians 4:31. Paul writes to the Ephesians, he tells them this. He says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Now if we take a deep look at that word anger here, the Greek word here is orge, and that means a wrath, pure hatred. It's not just a simple anger, right? This is an uncontrollable, violent passion, is what Christ is addressing here, because God tells us to be angry at sin. He tells us to abhor and hate sin, which is a righteous way to use our emotions, our feelings. When we see evil in this world, it should make you feel some type of emotion, right? God made us with these emotions, but He does want us to be controlled. And right here, when we look at this word specifically, what Jesus is addressing, it is a violent, wrathful passion or hatred. And like you said, most manuscripts do, and especially in our King James and New King James, some of them don't have without a cause, some of them do in the older manuscripts. I don't think that really hurts the text in any way. But keep in mind that there is some anger that is natural that the Lord has given us. And the Lord Himself has these emotions, so it's not a complete prohibition on never be angry. Right?
He didn't sin. Be angry and sin not.
Exactly. Be angry and sin not. That's where I was going to go. But you look at Christ. What did He do when He entered the temple and He saw the money changers? Is anyone familiar? He flipped tables over. I wouldn't say He was in a too fantastic of a mood there. I'm sure He had some anger as He fastened the whip. I'm sure there was some anger on His mind, but this is not what they're talking about. I'm sure some of us know some people who get to a boiling point so quickly, so wrathful, to where they're easy to cut you off. I see some finger pointing out there. But they're so easy to cut you off and go after each other's necks. And that's what He's saying here is, you need to love your brother. You need to not have these passions that can lead to killing. A lot of individuals don't just snap and kill somebody, right? It takes time, it takes situation, it takes these emotions to build up. Most of the time there's some things before that really set this, and also an attitude as well. And He just wants us to be peacemakers, like He said before, and not to have these kind of emotions, these kind of feelings. And then verse 22, He kind of expands on this. And it's very interesting what He says here. It says, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, right here I have Raca. Raca. That is vain fellow or fool, shall be in danger of the council, but whosoever shall say, thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. So, Raca is the vain fellow. And it's a tone of voice, is how it's really described, how someone is treated. It's an expression of bitter contempt and indignation. It's commonly referred to as worthless or empty-headed. So whenever you call somebody worthless or empty-headed, is the phrase here. Raca would be our equivalent today. Stupid, witless, moron, dumb. Those are kind of synonymous terms for that. Yes, sir?
heard another preacher one time describe that as being so disgusted that you turn around and spit after you say it.
Exactly.
You know,
That's
you're worthless.
That's really good. That's a really good illustration. Just turning and spitting at someone, you know, they're not worth your time. And it's almost looking down at your nose with somebody, you know. That's kind of the feeling that is expressed. Ma'am? So this is scorning someone's heart and their character. And Raca is really, I think the simplest way to put it is calling him stupid. But I do want to preface this as well. God does call people stupid or fools. And turn with me to Romans chapter 1, we'll see that. But remember that without a cause, this is the kind of attitude that we're to have, or not to have. In Romans chapter 1, we see that that Paul writes to the church in Rome. Let's see, right here in verse 21. Somebody read Romans 1:21 for me.
Because although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened.
Right. Said that they had foolish hearts, foolish minds, stupid mind. Essentially, yes, sir.
Well, in this case, and in the case where he turned over the tables at the temple, that they had showed open disobedience and disregard for God.
Exactly. Verse 22. Look at the next verse. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. That's correct. So they're saying they're starting to worship the creation rather than the Creator. We see this with a lot of today modern day scientists. They look at God's creation and they say this is greater than God. There can be no God. And they state things like their degrees, their scholarship, education. I'm up here, you're down here. They're wise. But God says here in verse 22 that they became fools. They became foolish, dumb, stupid in their minds. How could you have so much intelligence to be able to look at the inner workings of a cell and not see that the mechanics of just one cell of a human body, a blood cell, has so much design and creation to it, and not understand that it was something that had to have been made? They became foolish. So when the Lord uses this term, and He does a lot, as well as Paul and others in the New Testament writings, we can't do this without a cause. We can't go around and call people stupid, morons, and have this wrathful indignation against them. That is what Jesus equates to murder. And that's really where murder stems from, is these kind of people, these kind of attitudes. And I know it's tough. He's telling these individuals because a lot of these individuals are guilty of that. These Pharisees, scribes, and even those disciples who are in the crowd. It's easy to get angry, and He's telling them that they need to control it. Romans, if any of you are taking notes, Romans 14:4 is also a great verse for this as well. It says, "Who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he standeth or falleth. Yea, he shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand." When we do exercise judgment against someone, it can't be unrighteous, and I can't state that enough. Also, going back to our text in Matthew 5. Exactly. That's another synonymous term, malice. And we read that in Ephesians 4:31. It's a separate term, but a lot of those are pretty synonymous. That's a good point there. But back at verse 22. In danger of the council. A lot of people don't have an understanding of what that is. I think some translations say, does anyone else have anything different rather than the council? Sanhedrin.
Mine says Supreme Court.
Or Supreme Court. That is what it would be our modern day equivalent, Supreme Court, but the Sanhedrin or the council really is just it was a supreme Jewish court of their time. It consisted of 70 to 71 members. And on this council they had scribes, priests, elders, and the high priest. So what these individuals did on this council is that they dealt with matters of Jewish law and criminal offenses. So it would be, they would deal with matters both spiritual, if somebody violated the Sabbath, as well as their physical laws, if somebody stole. So they kind of had a mixture of both. Today it would be like if if our elders here were also police officers. I guess it would be kind of like an intermixing where they judge both your criminal acts as well as your spiritual condition, which the elders are in charge of the flock and their spiritual condition. So it would be kind of like the equivalent of that. But obviously we don't live under the same kind of Mosaic system as them. But he's saying that you're in danger for doing this, for calling somebody Raca fool, puts you in the danger of that council, of Jewish court, of Jewish law. Although that was never dealt with accordingly. So that's bad. But Christ takes it a step further, and he says, but whoever shall say, thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. So he's saying, yeah, it's bad enough to have to deal with the court, but there's more to it than a physical standing before a council. And that's the whole point of what he's saying here. Now you're in danger of hellfire. So he's just kind of pressing that fact in verse 22. So any questions on that, on the anger aspect? Yes, sir.
I think he's kind of talking about one part of it is your morals, and that other part seems to be your spirit, your soul being in danger.
Yep.
Because it's two different places there. You're in the world here, now you're taken to your spirit.
Exactly. That's 100% correct. And he's addressing both those things, and even a physical aspect too when standing in front of that council. So he's looking at your morals, he's looking at your soul. That is a very good point. So he's saying you can't break these. It's simple. He's expanding on this law. So we'll move on if anyone has any questions. A really good preface to this is don't cast judgment on someone that you do not know. But let's move to verse 23. He says, therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and there rememberest that thy brother hath aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First be reconciled to thy brother, then come and offer thy gift. And Christ is saying here, if you realize you're guilty of these things that he addressed, the anger and the malice, he says, don't come to worship. Why do you think he says that? If you're in danger, if you have this wrath and indignation against your brother, don't come to worship. Leave your gift at the altar. Don't sacrifice, is what he's saying. And go and make things right before you come back.
Get right with God and come back.
You said get right with
Get right with God and come back. Brother, it gets hard right.
Right. Get right with God before you come back. But I thought the hatred and sin was against your brother.
Well, yeah, brother. Love thee and love your brother.
That's right. That's right. They're interconnected. You put the dots together perfectly. If you're sinning against your brother, you have hatred against your brother, you're sinning against God. And this is a principle laid out in 1 John chapter 4, verses 20 and 21. Look at 1 John chapter 4, verses 20 and 21. And this is one that is particular a problem for the Pharisees because they had a whole lot of hate against people like the Samaritans. That's why Jesus always used them as an example. They're their neighbor, the Samaritans. They were such a group that was hated by them. Just their descendant, like where they came from, caused indignation and wrath against them. So, and that was most of the Jewish population. You would even see that with the disciples who were following Christ had that issue as well when they would come to Samaria. But in 1 John chapter 4, verses 20 and 21, can someone read that for me, please?
If someone says, I love God and hates is a lie. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? And this commandment we have from him, that he who loves God must love his brother also.
So loving your brother, loving your neighbor, they're interconnected with loving God. You can't separate the two. So if you're having issues loving your brother or loving whoever it is, whether it's your spouse, friends, family who get under your skin, it's going to be really hard to love God because you've seen these individuals. And God is not seen. So these things he shows in 1 John 4 are intertwined. You can't break them apart. So if you think that you can come before God here Sunday morning and offer sacrifice and worship, that's what we're going to talk about later, with a good conscience when you have hatred in your heart, there's better things to do, I guess, if you don't get right. And I hate to say that, but it is pointless sitting in the pew with this kind of attitude.
Don't ever hate to say the truth.
That's right. So he who loves God must love his brother. Imagine trying to bring a sacrifice at that time when you can't stand your neighbor. You have to make these things right. God is concerned with your heart. And if you do go before God, it's really showing a fake love towards God and whatever else. So that's kind of the gist of what he's saying there in Matthew chapter 5. So any questions about bringing your gifts to the altar, which is essentially today would be our sacrifice, coming to worship, coming to the Lord's day. In verse 25, he expands on how to get this. He expands a little more on this aspect as well. He says, agree with thine adversary quickly, while thou art in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer, and thou be cast into prison. Verily I say unto thee, thou shalt by no means come out thence, till thou hast paid the othermost farthing, or penny. It's their currency when you see that word farthing. So he says, it's better to talk to your brother than to talk to the judge. If you can hash things out between your brother at that point, where there's anger or malice, or if you are having issues in any kind of way, whether it's your wife, spouse, friend, family, whoever, it's better to go one-on-one and get it hashed out than to be seen before a council, correct? This could be used in good application with the church, rather than bickering and fighting between the two and getting elders involved, and now other people may hear of it, and then gossip starts, and then there's all kinds of problems that can stem from this. So Jesus is saying, just go to each other, one-on-one, get it hashed out, and there shouldn't be any issues. Handle it at the lowest level is what we're told in the military. Before you I was in the Air Force for a couple of years, and if you had an issue with somebody, they would always say, handle it at the lowest level. Why? Because as you escalate things, more people are involved, and it can stem into other issues. So there's a whole lot of wisdom in what God and what Christ here is trying to say. It shows unity. It shows forgiveness. It shows the complete opposite of this wrathful anger and murder in the heart that he's addressing. And he gives us the option to do what's right before we are charged with it. God is giving us that right too. He's saying you can make things right before any consequences come of it. So he's saying not to let these things labor in your heart. So the next thing Christ is going to address, if anyone doesn't have any questions on the anger and murder. In verse 27, he's going to shift from anger and murder into another big one, and that's lust. He's going to shift to the lust of the heart. In verse 27, he says, Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery. Once again, we see one of those commandments, right? Thou shalt not commit adultery. That's Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, if you want that reference. Exodus chapter 20, verse 14 is also reiterated in Deuteronomy 5:18. And here we would see that a pure law from God, from His own finger, is taken by the scribes and the Pharisees, and once again, it's going to be manipulated historically. They're going to find loopholes. These men, the scribes and the Pharisees, are going to go to areas where, as they're married, they're going to go to some of these areas where there might be harlots standing out of the street. And it was a common practice that they would walk by and just window shop, so to speak. They wouldn't commit adultery. They wouldn't go and pay for the woman's services, but they would look at them. They would take their time strolling past these harlots, and they would lust after them. Right? And their mindset was, I'm not committing adultery with my wife, therefore, what's the problem? What's the issue? And this is a really big one today, is it? Is it not? This one will strike a chord with some folks. But right here, we see that Jesus is going to address, really, essentially, it's the home. And it starts with the home. He says, right here, if the home's not right, so goes the nation. And, oh man, lust has become such a big problem. It's divided homes. And if we are to go back to the teachings of Christ here, Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 and following, how many issues would be taken care of that we see in our society today? Yes, sir.
You just saw where was the guy that's Roman Catholic, but still, the guy that kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs made all those statements. You know about the home and the wife and everything.
Yep.
But they're after him already. I mean, he's taking the blunt of being right about family, and it just the breakdown of any nation is a loss of family.
Exactly.
I'll probably get in trouble on this too. But I'm telling you, everybody told everybody that had to go to college and get a degree, and then all the women went to work. I'm telling you, I'm getting in trouble on this. I know. My wife even worked, but when the woman left the house and went to work, a lot of things happened in our society. If you understand what I'm saying, I mean, it caused a big breakdown of the family because they left the home. Now, there are some jobs you can.
There's some
I
aspects.
know I'm going to get in trouble because I want to make this statement. But you just look at all the women that went into higher jobs, and it's nothing wrong with them working. Don't get me wrong, but it's just not. If you went over to Titus, it says teach the younger women how to love their husbands, keep their house, and children. I mean, there's always something to go back on that. And I know that we get in such, I know I'm talking about, but we get in such bind financially that both people have to go to work to supply the needs of the family to a certain extent. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes, sir.
And it's hard to keep a family together on that. I'm telling you. I mean, you can look and see.
Right. You had a comment, man?
Oh, no, just real.
You worked 32 years for home.
So there's a
I
point.
tell you, there are cases where it's
It's
really
a bill,
there's a
it's a bill
point
I
to it.
work for home.
I mean, you have some great application there.
I agree. I do, yeah. It's a shame, but I do agree.
And it's a controversial aspect. Yes, sir.
I think a lot of it has to do with we want more things.
Right.
Right. We're focused, people are focused on having things, so they have to make more money to have more things. They don't want to sacrifice things to have a home.
Right.
Yeah. You have houses, but there's a difference between a house and a home.
That's correct.
You know, so
And these things are clearly under attack. So goes a home, so goes a nation. Right? That's the saying. And to your point, yes, the home has always been under attack because that is the first institution that really God created was marriage. You go back to the garden, Genesis. When He put Adam and Eve together, He created that home. And women, they're better at nurturing and raising children. It's just how it is. And then in Titus, the same book that you reference, men are to be the ones that nourish their children, and that word nourish there is discipline. So typically men are more of the disciplinary. We don't have the mind, we don't have the brain, and you made a good point on material things. What would you give up for your children materially?
Well, a lot of give up their family. I mean, that's what I'm talking about.
Right.
Guys they care nothing about their kids.
Right, but I'm saying you're correct. But we don't think like that. What would you do physically? What would you trade for your child's life? Anybody?
Everything.
You wouldn't,
Nothing I wouldn't.
there was nothing you wouldn't give up for your child, correct? Any amount of money. Yet we do that today with the souls of our children. We do that with the souls of our children today.
It doesn't have to be that way.
It doesn't have to. My wife works. She works from home. She makes it work. Understand not everyone can do that. Not everyone can homeschool. But mothers need to be involved in their children's lives just like fathers as well. And right here, really, when he's addressing lust, this is going to be more aimed at the men. And you can tell, Jesus' wording, he's going to really be calling out the men here for the most part. But this goes both ways. This has dual application, but a lot of the problems we see are with the men. Let's look back at this verse and break it down. So the household is established with the mother and the father. Not having one of these isn't ideal to God's plan. Right? We understand things happen. Men pass on, women pass on, but the ideal of God's household, His institution, is one man, one woman, raising their children. And God gave the home these laws in Deuteronomy to protect the nation of Israel. Because if you take away these men, they're out chasing other women, or the wives leave the husband with the children, the home's going to deteriorate. It's not meant to operate in that function. So the Lord set these safeguards to protect the home, and now we see men and women, specifically at this time period, men going out and just disregarding all of these things, and then trying to make loopholes. And he says, look at verse 28. He says, "But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart." So adultery of the heart and adultery in practice are both addressed here.
But in the Old Testament, it was physical when Jesus brought it in. But the New Testament, it became spiritual.
Right. But even in the Old Testament, it was a spiritual law, but with physical repercussions. But today it's the opposite. Today it's a spiritual law, but exactly, one leads to the other. Just like the anger or wrath towards your brother leads to murder, now lust and adultery in your heart leads to actually doing it. Most men aren't just going to go and, oh hey, there's a woman just randomly on the street, just want to shack up with her for the most part. It usually takes, especially married men who are faithful, even faithful men who have fallen victim to this. They see a woman, and they see the way that she's dressed, and he looks a little too long, and then he wants to approach her, talk to her, and that leads to the adultery in practice, in physical. Because he loves her, and he wants her in his heart. Yes, sir.
As we're going through all of these different things that he's warning us against, one, and I understand everything everybody's saying, but one is not any worse than the other. He's talking, it is in this life.
Yes.
But
the consequences.
The consequences. But he's talking about self-control.
Correct.
On all of these things that he brought up here, we have to be self-controlled with the Spirit controlling ourselves.
That's one of the fruits of the Spirit.
And so, if we can't control ourselves, we're going to get off in all kinds of messes, and it wouldn't just be that, it could be any of these others.
Correct.
Well,
and, yes, sir.
It's really sad, right? Because we know we have black funds, we have our guidelines that we should be using. Some of the churches create the loopholes.
Yep.
Right? When I'm doing up Catholic, it didn't matter. I could do whatever I wanted to all week long, or I made it to confession on Sunday.
That's right.
And I can go redo it again next week.
Yep. And that's the exact Pharisee mentality.
Yeah. So it's like, what's the world coming to? How's the world gonna deal with it when they're being taught that it's not necessary?
Well, they don't have a ideal Psalm 119, 104. They don't have this mindset. Both men and women who fall into this. Psalm 119, 104 says, Though thy precepts I get understanding, therefore I hate every false way. We're to hate all these things, whether it's the just the lust of the heart or the actual lust in practice. And in verse 28, I want to mention that Jesus is not condemning natural desires of humans. Okay? As mankind, we are created with attraction. Right? Males attracted to female, that's natural. And females attracted to male. There's nothing unnatural about that. It's a common thing. It was made in us. It's necessary. Right? It's not to be that's not to be just completely disregarded. But God created man to be attracted to the opposite sex, Hebrews 13:4. And He created an institution, what we're talking about, marriage, for that. He created a great and beautiful institution that is undefiled, that is pure. There's a pure way to take your desires in a healthy way in marriage. Hebrews 13:4 says, marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. See, He made consummation in these things for man. And they're supposed to be pure and holy and beautiful.
1 Corinthians chapter 7 addresses all that.
Yes, 1 Corinthians 7.
The whole thing.
Yep.
Addresses the marriage how it's supposed to be.
Yep. And I'll go as far as to say to be tempted in itself is not necessarily a sin either. Whether it be anger or even in lust. So let me expand on that real quick before we end class. But just like anger escalates, when you get angry at first, somebody does something wrong against you, you get anger, right? But the wrath is acting on that anger or letting it sit, dwell, fester, and then acting on it. So it's different to be angry than it is to actually go out and hate your brother. The same goes with lust. A man sees a woman who looks nice and he sees it and he looks away, right? He's just abated lust. He had that temptation, but he just drew it away because it's natural for men. And same for women. But to look away and to not dwell on these things, that's the healthy aspect of these things. It's not like what the Pharisees were doing, gawking and staring at these women. In James chapter 1, verses 14 and 15 cover this. So if you are taking notes, James chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. It says here, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bring forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. Okay, and temptation on its own is not inherently sinful. It is when you dwell on it and it becomes lust, then lust draws you away and it entices you, and then it conceives and brings forth that sin.
Yeah, and that's the Bible translation. Way.
Right. So, remember, the temptation in itself is never a sin. Right? We can't say that. Why? Why can't we say temptation is sinful?
But the only person that has never been tempted is Jesus.
What's that?
The only one person who had never been tempted was Jesus.
The devil tempted, but he didn't give him that.
Well, he was tempted, but he didn't succumb to the temptation.
Exactly. He's the only person to never succumb to temptation.
He didn't act on it at all.
The text tells us that Jesus was tempted at all points as we are,
Right.
as man. He had the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and pride of life, but he didn't act on it.
Right.
That's a good
what I
point.
meant to say there.
Yes, sir. I knew what you were saying.
I was going there, but I was going back way.
Yeah.
So, once again, that's a clarification for that, and the Lord is just trying to tell us to look at the root of some of these issues and to handle them at the lowest point so they don't come and bring forth pain, agony, and death. Any questions before we conclude?
How the world today, parties and stuff, you go to that, the temptation part, there are people, ladies, and people out there come to these parties with the total intention of having everybody there to love them. They're dressing for it, they're acting on it, they're putting it out there.
aspects to that. That's a good point, but not just parties.
Yeah, no, look, TV.
Yeah, television. That's much closer. Your cell phone. That's right. That's what Jesus is going to address the next verse. I wanted to get there, but he gives how not to do this. He gives the answer. He tells them to pluck out their eyes, cut off their hands, not literally, but figuratively. Remove yourself from the situation, what you're talking about. Remove yourself in any temptation. If you're having a problem with lusting on your computer, what do you need to do?
Turn it off.
Turn it off, or put some safeguards up, or do something so you don't keep falling in the same pattern. The same with your phones, whatever else. Make the change, because it's better to lose that computer than it is to lose your soul for eternity.